Welcome to our virtual celebration of World Ocean Day. It's one of those holidays, designated days, that maybe should be every day of the year because we are dependent on the ocean for a whole variety of things. And that's one of the things that I hope that you get from chatting with you this afternoon, is the extent to which the ocean is important to us. My name is Tina Miller-Way, and I work over in the education group here at the Dauphin Island Sea Lab. That group aims to educate our young folks about the ocean, the importance of the ocean, and does that by sharing those experiences with them, going out to the salt marsh, for example, or going on the boat and showing them who lives in an estuary. And so we focus on showing those things and demonstrating those things with hands-on experiences. And so I brought some props with me today that I'll use as I talk a little bit about oyster reefs and the oyster reef restoration efforts that are happening in our area. So let's see, what do we have here? Oysters, and you can see them in this oyster reef tank here, is the iconic animal or representative animal of an estuarine environment or an estuary. And an estuary is an environment in which fresh water mixes with salt water. In this environment, oysters grow, reproduce, and when they reproduce, they settle on each other and they make a reef-like structure. If you look at the tank here, you can kind of see the oyster shells in that and the fact that they are creating some structure there. I've also brought some examples here of oysters that have settled on one another and are beginning to create a reef-like structure there. So oyster reefs are a habitat that reaches the greatest importance, if you will, in estuarine environments. You can kind of see the way that these shells, the oyster settles on top of other oysters, and the fact that the oyster shell gets colonized and grown on by a variety of other organisms. So this complex of oyster shells is what creates the oyster reef. And the oyster in our neck of the woods is the eastern oyster, or the scientific name of that animal is the Chrysostrea virginica. And that's what this exhibit talks about, is the importance of the eastern oyster in our area. So when these reefs are created by the oysters, that oyster reef habitat becomes an incredibly important part of the estuary, an important habitat in our area, and a habitat that's worth protecting and restoring for a whole number of reasons. And I hope to communicate to you some of those reasons here today. So I brought here my little friend, the oyster, out of a tank that we have down in the education programs. It is a live oyster. He's gotten a little jostled on the way over here, so I'm not sure he's going to open up and perform for us, but oysters are filter feeding animals. That is that they get their food by straining the particles from a current of water that moves through the body of the oyster. And of course, in an environment, there are edible particles and non-edible particles. So there are sediment particles that maybe have been resuspended from the bottom of the bay, but there's also algae in that food, and that's what the oyster feeds on. So what I have here in my hand is a concentrated solution of algae, and I'm going to try and feed this oyster and see if we can see how, when I first put the algae in, the water is a little bit turbid because of these suspended algal cells, but that as it opens up and feed, the water becomes a little clearer over time. So I'm just going to put a few drops in here and then stir it around, and perhaps Angela can show from the top against this white background that water becomes a little bit brownish colored. Get that algae suspended there, distributed throughout the water. I think if you look at that now, you can see it kind of has a brownish tint to it against that white background. Kind of see that a little bit on the camera there. But we're going to let this oyster sit here. I'm not going to disturb it for a while and see if it'll open up and demonstrate the impact of filter feeding for that. But in case this doesn't perform, I've also brought our model oyster that we use when we teach students about the oyster and how important it is in the bay. This is Jenny. Jenny is our model oyster, and she has all the parts that an oyster has, but represented in fabric. It's kind of hard to see that on the contrast of the screen there, but point out a couple of obvious things that are dark and maybe easier to see. This dark brown mass here is the muscle that holds the valves or the two shells of the oyster together. This red piece here is actually the heart of an oyster. Yes, oysters have hearts, right? But what you see along the edge of this model is some frilly stuff here, right? These are a structure in the oyster known as gills. And in an oyster, the gills are the filter feeding organ. They're the things, if you will, that help strain the particles from the water as the water flows through the body of an oyster. I do have a picture here. Of course, in a real oyster, they look a little bit different. Not sure if you can see that there. But these are the gills of an oyster. They kind of have that striped appearance to that, but that is the filter feeding organ. So an oyster feeds by creating a current through the body, and these gills have little hair-like structures on them that help create that current. As that current comes through the body, the oyster captures the particles that are suspended in that water. It rolls them up with some mucus. Mucus makes the world go round in some animals, and brings them up to this structure here, which are called the labial palps, and then into the mouth of the oyster. And as we go in our model here, as we go from the gills to the labial palps to the stomach, it is a different color fabric. So this green that you see represents the intestine, the stomach, and then the intestine of the oyster. So in our model, we show the students that these oysters have in their stomach particles, algae particles, which we represent with these wooden buttons. So this is the stomach of the oyster and shows that they are straining out the edible particles from that water. Now, just as your body does, and a lot of other animal bodies, what is not digested, right, moves through the intestine and then is egested or pooped, as we say. So what we have here is the feces, a representation of the feces of an oyster. So what is not digested is pooped out by the oyster. And it turns out, some of my work has shown that that poop turns out to be a really rich food source for a lot of other organisms in that oyster reef community. So the other thing I like to point out is some of you may have heard about oysters as pearl-forming organisms. And Jenny does have a pearl in her shell. So a pearl is formed simply when an irritant gets between the mantle of the this layer of tissue and the shell of an oyster. And just like when you get a sand spur or a burr in your clothes, it's an irritant, and so the animal lays down a layer of shell to help reduce that irritant. But we have managed to make them into some very pretty jewelry. So this is Jenny, our oyster model, demonstrating the organs, the parts of the oyster that are important in filter feeding. So let me put her down here. These oysters are incredible filter feeders. A single oyster can filter up to 50 gallons of water per day. And in estuaries, it's not uncommon to find oysters at densities of about 500 per. An oyster reef that is only 1 meter wide and 20 meters long is about 10,000 oysters, and that's filtering about and strain it and remove the particles. Right? In fact, San Francisco Bay, shallow estuary with a large filter feeding population, it's been shown that that population processes or filters the water of that bay completely, 100% every 2 to 3 days. That's a pretty amazing filter feeding capacity. Right? The filtering removes particles from the water, and of course it feeds the oyster. That's what the oyster grows and lives on. But it also results in a clear water column. And that is one of the services, if you will, one of the valuable parts of an oyster reef habitat is the ability of that reef to improve water clarity, cleaner or less turbid, have less particles in it. And so if we talk about the beneficial parts of an oyster reef, certainly water clarity is one of those. And that's one of the reasons that scientists are to restore oyster reefs because of that ecosystem service of improving water quality for them. All right, so moving back to these oyster reefs now, as these animals settle and grow on one another, they form this large structure, right? And that large structure, the oyster reef, is what filter feeds a lot of through the estuary. But of course I showed you that lots of things start to grow these shells. Certainly there's barnacles, there's some worm too. There's a kind of segmented worm that forms a little calcareous tube that's very common on the top of oyster shells. We have some scars from baby oysters settling on these oyster shells. You can also see some algae or hydroids has grown on the shell itself. Sponges will actually bore into, I was looking for an oyster that has some sponge boring marks on it, but sponges will actually bore into the shell itself. Here's another one that another oyster has settled on. So that oyster reef structure actually creates a habitat for other organisms, right? So of course anytime that you have these invertebrates, they're a source of food for some other things. So we find that associated with oyster reefs are not only these sessile creatures or these animals that are attached to the oyster shell, but there are also fish and other animals that cruise the oyster reef area looking for food, looking for prey items, right? So the oysters provide food because we harvest them. They also provide food to things other than humans, things that live in that environment, right? So let's see, so they are providing these surfaces for animals to colonize, but they're also the structure itself, and you can kind of see that in the tank here. There are a lot of little hidey holes that are present between these individual shells. In fact, I can see one of the fish hiding there in between the shells. So the oyster reef community also serves as a refuge, a hiding place for some of the mobile animals, the animals that can move around that structure and enable them to avoid being eaten or preyed upon, right? So they're a source of food, they're a source of habitat, and they're a source of the ability, if you will, to improve the water clarity in that area. One of the other things that the Sea Lab scientists are studying here is that oyster reefs, because of being a physical structure in the water, also seem to have an effect on shoreline erosion. And I have a little demo I kind of wanted to share with you today to talk a little bit about that, that this physical structure actually can absorb wave energy as a wave comes into shore. Not so sure it could absorb the wave energy that's out there today. Certainly we're under Tropical Storm Cristobal, and the water is very churned up, and we have very large waves hitting our coast here. But this is maybe, if you will, a demo on a quiet day for Dauphin Island. So what I have here is a shoreline on a typical sandy beach, right? You can see the water level. You can see the beach is above that. And in half of this, I've put a model of an oyster reef structure. Can you see that? All right. So what we're going to do is make some waves. We're going to make some waves and look at the impact of having that oyster reef just offshore on part of the model and compare that to the other side of the model. And now I did have a wave maker. Let me grab that here. So if we just make some gentle waves, not the strong ones that we might be finding offshore today, just regular waves. This is a much easier way. For some of my research, I actually made a large wave tank, built it and left it in the coastal zone. This is a lot easier just making a little one. It looks like I also see some marine debris that got into my sand from the beach. One of the things you can see, I think you can begin to see a difference in where that shoreline is between the shore, or the beach in front of the oyster reef, and the beach on the exposed side, the side not protected by the oyster reef, right? So shoreline erosion, that movement of sand from the beach down into the ocean, is a big deal around here. Certainly as a property owner, you wouldn't want to lose your shoreline there. And the protection that an oyster reef gives you, right, from that shoreline erosion is a good thing, right? Can you see the difference there? You can see that the shoreline is about at the same position on the oyster reef side. We'll pick out the marine debris there. But on the exposed side, we've lost some of that sand from the beach down into the ocean. I think you can get an idea of that from just that short period of time making waves, right? So shoreline erosion is a big issue around the shores of Mobile Bay. A lot of Mobile Bay is bulkheaded, if you will, on the shoreline. That is, there is a hard physical structure there. And those bulkheads actually end up having a lot of negative consequences when they do fail. So there is a movement on landowners and also in larger scale to protect that shoreline with some living structures, and an oyster reef is one of those. I'm not sure that Meg talked about some of the restoration shoreline projects that are going on, and talked a little bit about the wave attenuation devices and stuff, but this oyster reef works very similar. The physical structure of that reef actually absorbs some of that wave energy, and that is hypothesized to reduce rates of shoreline erosion. And that structure, because it's made of living materials, is referred to as a living shoreline. And so you'll hear some people refer to oysters and oyster reef communities as ecosystem engineers. That is, they are changing their environment enough by their physical rate of some of these processes to change what processes are dominant in a certain environment. And so when we look at this as a whole, those oyster reefs have some benefits for people just by virtue of being there, being intact. Those intact ecosystem does for people, does for humans, that we don't pay for, are sometimes referred to as ecosystem services, right? So one of the reasons that oyster reefs are such valuable habitats is because of the ecosystem services that they provide. Certainly they provide a source of food, right? Food for us, for people who like to eat oysters, certainly food for the other animals that prey on oysters or prey on animals that live in that oyster reef community. They create habitat, so in fact the fishermen in Mobile Bay often fish around the restored oyster reefs in this area because the fish are more likely to be found in those areas. So food, habitat, water clarity because of the filtration capacity of oysters, and then lastly this potential for reduced shoreline erosion. So those are ecosystem services, if you will, that are provided by a healthy living oyster reef. It turns out that humans have had a pretty good impact on oyster reefs. Oyster populations, that is the number of oysters found in our estuaries globally, is down about 80 to 85%. Not as many oyster reef communities as they used to be. And because of this and these valuable ecosystem services that oyster reefs provide, there's a fair amount of work going on right now to restore oyster reef communities. There are scientists here at the Sea Lab that are looking at the best ways to do that. What is the most cost-efficient way to do that? What is, how should we put those oysters back into the environment? And if you have the chance to come on down to the Aquarium of Alabama, out on the boardwalk there is a display about living shorelines and a couple of 3 different techniques tested to see which is the best way to restore oyster reefs. Put into the water with the idea that the oysters will actually settle on this concrete ball. It'll get colonized by all of these shells called the fouling community. And that once colonized by oysters and these other invertebrate animals, this will begin, or seed, if you will, an oyster reef coming back into that area. So this is one of the techniques that scientists are to restore oyster reefs. So there's a wonderful exhibit out on the boardwalk here, and get a chance to get out and about from the COVID pandemic. Please consider coming down and taking a look at that display. Why are these perilled ecosystems? And the reason for that is a variety of reasons. Certainly with Tropical Storm Cristobal over us today, we're thinking about hurricanes and hurricane season, and hurricanes do have a devastating impact on the oyster reefs, and that's been shown in Mobile Bay. As those hurricanes come through, they stir up a lot of sediment, and because this is a filter feeding animal, sediment deposited on top of that animal will cause it to feed, and it won't be able to breathe or respire. Oysters respire or get oxygen to their tissues. The reef with stirred up sediment from the waves, energy coming through with a hurricane, it kills the oysters in that reef. Humans have also over-harvested some areas of oysters, not left enough oysters in that environment for oysters to replenish themselves. So over-harvesting is one of the reasons that we don't have as many oysters out there today as we need. One of the other reasons is when we have some chemical disasters. Certainly the Deepwater Horizon incident is one of those things which is providing funds that are allowing some of this oyster reef restoration effort to go on. But the oil will smother those oysters and kill them also. And other forms of chemical pollution in our estuaries. Estuaries are that environment most affected by human activities. We put a lot of chemicals into their environment, and some of those are detrimental to the oysters. Other disasters, pollution, various forms of pollution, over-harvesting, and let's see, one of the other reasons I wanted to, the culch, right? So we take those shells to the oyster shucking factory, and we shuck the body of the oyster out of the shell, and then pile up the shells next to the oyster shucking factory. And those piles, if you've been through the bayou, can get very large. But the oyster, when it reproduces by shedding eggs and sperm to the water where they meet planktonic larvae. That is a larvae that floats around in the water as it develops. And at a certain point of its development, it will settle down, but it will not settle on mud. It needs to settle on shells and hard structure that's already there. So if the hard structure is not already there, we have reduced settlement, and over the period of several generations, we have less oysters than what should be there. So oyster reef restoration, and the best way to do that is a big effort in our area right now. We're not doing question and answer? No, okay. So I've kind of given a snapshot, I think, of oyster reefs as habitat, and hopefully you've gotten some of the reasons that we should be spending time and effort during some of those oyster reefs. And they are one of those critical habitats that, as we talk about the need to protect a certain percentage or a certain part of the world, we're not just going to, willy-nilly decide this amount. We're looking for areas that are rich in biodiversity, areas that are important to an oyster reef, and those are what we're calling priority areas, and areas that are worth protecting. So with that, I'd like to the Aquarium of Alabama. We are open for business, reduced hours, I also want to point out that if you wanted to learn more about restoration, we offer down in the education program this summer, we're actually offering a virtual workshop in habitat restoration. So we're talking about oyster reef restoration. We're also talking about seagrass restoration and salt marsh restoration. Normal routine, we hope in the fall. We encourage you to come down and bring students and bring them through our education programs. So we hope to see you again, not too many weeks much.